Well, thank you very much, Dr. Phạm Quang Minh. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the research team, please allow me to deliver a presentation on the roles, performance, and contributions of women's representatives during the period 2016-2021. My presentation is divided into 5 parts. The first one is context. The second is the objectives of study, design of study, findings of the study, and finally, conclusions and important implications. Well, firstly, I would like to talk about the context of conducting this research. So there are several important facts here that necessitate our the research on this topic. We know that at the 7th plenum's resolution, we have the objectives that by 2030, we will have to have the women's representatives in the parties, committees, as well as the various agencies, including National Assembly and People's Councils. And we also have the gender equality indicator and target for 2019. And as well, and also, in reality, for the first time during this 5-year period, Vietnam has a chairwoman of the National Assembly. And the first delegate of the National Assembly initiating a law project is a woman delegate. The purpose, the objectives of our research is to contribute to the knowledge about the roles, performance, and contributions of women's representatives in the 14th National Assembly's tenure and People's Councils between 2016 and 2021, and also give us some implications in order to further leverage the roles and capacities of women in leadership and management in Vietnam. As for the methodology for this research, we have conducted both quantitative and qualitative studies with the questionnaire, including 25 questions in each on the experience and opinions of delegates of National Assembly and People's Councils. And with the qualitative study, we conducted in-depth interviews with members of the National Assembly, People's Councils, media, representatives of the National Assembly and People's Councils. So this is several in general information on the participating members of the National Assembly participating in this research. The total number of National Assembly delegates providing response is 248. 33.6% are women, and 23.9% are from the ethnic minorities. And we also have the total number of members of People's Councils participating in answering the questionnaire, which is 136 from Hanoi, Cần Thơ, and Bình Phước. So the data that we gained from the responses of the members of People's Councils from the 3 provinces of Hanoi, Cần Thơ, and Bình Phước. That's why the conclusions and the findings in the research do not represent other provinces in the country. However, the findings of the research still play a very important role in terms of possible extrapolation to other provinces with similarities to the ones that we have surveyed. Now, please allow me to go into the roles and performance of women's representatives. So the first important activity that we have surveyed is meeting voters. So besides voters' meetings for the National Assembly's delegates and People's Councils, many delegates of National Assembly and People's Councils are very proactive in meeting voters personally. So on this slide, you can see that around 50% of delegates do initiate meetings with their voters. And this ratio for women delegates in 2019 was higher than that initiated by men representatives, with a gap of almost 10%. And one of the very important findings of this research is that part of the delegates of National Assembly and People's Councils have been using social media to contact their voters. So this not only gives the diversity to the ways in which delegates of National Assembly and People's Councils meet their voters and communicate with their voters, but we also see that the ratio of National Assembly delegates using social media to communicate with voters is significantly higher than the members of the People's Councils. And also, women's delegates of National Assembly and People's Councils also use social media more than men in communicating with their voters. The next point we would like to talk about is the responses, the level of responses to dealing with recommendations, petitions, and complaints from voters between 2016 and 2021. The general message here is that both men and women members of National Assembly and People's Councils claim that they are highly responsive in dealing with petitions and complaints from their voters during this 5-year period. And with the 5-score scale here, 5-point scale, we could see that the score given to this activity was fairly high, 4.5, 4.6, 4.7. The next point we would like to refer to in this research is that the areas of focus in the action plans of the members of National Assembly, because this reflects very importantly, it is an important reflection of the function and the roles of members of National Assembly and People's Councils. And we can see that men members are more interested in defense and security than women representatives, while women members of the National Assembly focus more on education and training, healthcare, and ethnic minority issues. So this is the data updated on the 13th of January 2021 on the National Assembly's website, and looking at this number of members of different agencies, different committees of the National Assembly, there are significant differences. For example, for the Ethnic Council, we have 50-50 ratio. And we also have almost the same percentage of men and women members in the Committee for Culture, Education, Youth, and Adolescents. However, in other committees, for example, in the Finance and Budgetary Affairs, we only have 16.3% of members are women. Or, for example, on the Committee on National Defense and Security, only 7.5% are women. In the action plans of the members of the People's Councils, we could see the very important part we can see that both men and women members of the People's Council focus on training, education and training, labor, war invalids in society, and home affairs. So these are the focused areas in Provincial People's Council's Deputies' action plans. Next thing is the frequency of men and women's deputies in raising their voice, expressing their views in the sessions of the National Assembly and People's Councils. And we see that the members of the National Assembly, whether men or women, have a very high frequency of expressing opinions through different forms. So we see the scores here around 4.5, 4.6. So this is really high frequency. Now, moving on to the second part of the research, we are talking about the qualities and attributes of deputies of the National Assembly in performing their duties. Both men and women value the ability to listen and express opinions. And we also see that while both gender value the merits of listening and having personal viewpoints, women National Assembly delegates value having the ability to persuade others more than men delegates. So we see that the three most important merits here are listening, having personal viewpoints, and having the ability to persuade others. Well, the most important merits of the People's Council's members when on duty, both men and women value the merits of listening and having personal viewpoints and perseverance. So these are the three most important values that are confirmed by both genders. Another important point that the members of both National Assembly and People's Councils are looked for is having more women in the leaders' positions. The opinions of the role of women in state agencies. And we have a very important statement to ask for their opinion. More women holding leading positions in state agencies will contribute substantially to improving Vietnamese citizens' living standards. And the majority of National Assembly and People's Council's members agree with the above statement. The percentage of women delegates who agree with the statement is higher than the percentage of men delegates. And you can see the figures on the slide, which suggest that 67.9% of men delegates agree to this statement, while 83% of women agree with this statement. For the People's Council's level, we see that 72.9% of men members agree with the statement. And we also have a higher percentage of women agreeing to this statement at 81.3%. Another point here is the factor that influence the decision of the views to be represented or to be presented by members of the National Assembly and People's Councils. And we see that the most important factor that influence their voicing about specific issue is the interest in their own constituency. And almost 90% of women delegates of the People's Councils agree to this statement, and 71% of women agree with that at the National Assembly level. Now, please allow me to move on to the third part of this presentation, which is that the views and the expectations in the future for the members of both National Assembly and People's Councils. And we see 2/3 actually really high percentage of members providing response here say that the current representation of women in the 14th legislature is reasonable and good. And this finding is thought-provoking, especially when we compare it with the targets of having at least 35% of National Assembly delegates and People's Council's deputies being women by 2030, as provided for in the resolution of the 7th Central Committee. And another very important point is the view of the members of National Assembly and People's Councils on the potentials of increasing women's representation at National Assembly and People's Councils. And the statement is asked for the view is there will come a time when the number of women and men delegates to the National Assembly and People's Councils be equal. And 2/3 of the surveyed members of National Assembly and People's Councils are optimistic about the prospect of increasing the proportion of women in the NA and People's Councils in the future. It is also a very interesting thing that can give us hopes and expectations on the potential increase of women's representation at both levels in the future. And also in this part, we are asking about the activities that men and women members would be more interested in with regard to their activities if they are elected. And more than half of both men and women members of National Assembly said that they would spend more time on legislative activities if re-elected. And more women than men at the National Assembly level would spend more time on oversight function. When it comes to People's Councils, we see that men members of People's Councils would spend more time on the resolution development activities if re-elected for the next term. And also more women than men would spend time on overseeing the performance of important tasks at the local level if they are re-elected. So we can see the figures on the chart here suggesting, proving our findings. So now please allow me to move on to some of the important conclusions and implications from this research. Firstly, we can see that the interest of constituency is the most important influencing factor for men and women voicing their opinions on a particular issue. And we also see a higher proportion of women at both National Assembly and People's Councils who use social media to communicate with their voters. And both men and women members of National Assembly and People's Councils confirm that they are highly responsive in dealing with petitions and complaints from the constituency. And also, female members of the National Assembly focus more in their action plans on education, training, and healthcare. And almost the same proportion of men and women members of the People's Councils focus on education and training, labor, invalids, and social affairs, and Home Affairs. And there is not a significant difference between the views of men and women members on the three most important merits of elected representatives, on the listening, having their own view, and pursuing the issue. And also, there is a high percentage of members say that having women in the managerial and leaders positions of state agencies will contribute importantly to improving the livelihoods of the Vietnamese people. And the majority of members also say that the current proportion of women in the legislature, National Assembly, and People's Councils is reasonable, but many still expect and hope on the possibility of increasing the proportion of women members in both National Assembly and People's Councils in the future legislatures. And we have drawn several important implications from the research from three perspectives: policy implications, communication, and research implications. There are three policy implications. First, it is important to have the specific policies and roadmap to achieve the target of 35% women representatives in the National Assembly and People's Councils by 2030. And also to implement the international commitments on gender equality. And second, for the target of 35% of elected women members to be achieved, it is time for Vietnam to set the target of the 45% of nominees running for National Assembly and People's Councils to be stipulated in the election law. And also, it's important to create enabling environment for women, capable and qualified women to run for election in order to increase the quality of women candidates. For the communication implication, we see that it is important to confirm the role, performance, and contributions of women members of National Assembly and People's Councils through materializing the constitutional functions of elected representatives, and also to promote communication on the importance and interest of granting gender balance in the elected bodies. And also, for the research implication, we need to conduct further studies to develop the roadmap, plans, and the implementation for these purposes. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your listening.